Hello and welcome to Two Guys, One Game. This time round we're taking a look at a handful of games in a genre that was pretty popular on the SNES, the beat 'em up. Not to be confused with games like Street Fighter 2, beat 'em ups were popular arcade games that often got console ports, usually letting one or two players smash bad guys in the face with their fists and whatever they could find laying around. Now, as usual, we're trying to talk about some games that don't often get as much coverage, so there'll be no Final Fight or Turtles in Time here, but there are plenty of games on the system, so I'm sure they'll appear at some point in the future. Don't forget to comment below to let us know your favourite beat 'em up for the SNES, and any other system for that matter. I'm a fan of the genre and like finding new games. Now, how about I shut the hell up and we take a look at some games. We are going to start with a game that I'm pretty sure most of you will know, and that is Battletoads in Battle Maniacs from Rare. This game is of course famous for being a fecking tough one, and playing it again for this episode, it has held up as having that reputation. Known for having more than a little influence from those heroes in a half shell, the game sees you play as man-toads who set out to rescue their mate who's been kidnapped by a sexy space witch. You of course do this over a variety of levels that see you pummeling enemies in the face with your fists. What is amusing though is at the end of your combos to finish off the enemies, your limbs transform into various objects to deliver the killing blow. These are pretty cool, but you also do take a bit of time to do them, leaving you open to attack from enemies, and when the game is already balls hard, this does feel a little bit cheap. Something I noticed early on is that I really had no idea how many hits enemies took before they were going to die. There's no health bar for the enemies, and it seemed that sometimes the enemy would take 1 or 2 hits, and then other times the exact same enemy would take about 20 hits. Now, I don't know if that was just me being crap or what. Let's talk about the graphics for a bit. They are great. I really like the art style and the animation here is very good. There's a lot of detail and the bosses are huge and fun to fight, if you can get to them that is. And you do have to be especially careful when fighting bosses, as they often have attacks that kill you in one hit, which is not fun. As with most Rare games, the sound and music here is also great, and overall the presentation is just really well done. It's just that the difficulty quickly stops the game from being actually fun, and it just becomes frustrating and very cheap to play. Levels are littered with death traps that kill you instantly, forcing you to learn the levels, and while this is relatively common for games of the time, it's just so noticeable here, and it will really take new players a long time to even get past the first level. What doesn't help is that there's no health power-ups at all, or not that I could see anyway. You do get your health back at the start of every level, and you get a few extra lives here and there, but it's never enough to really be useful. You do get a few continues, but you'll soon see them run out, and if you use one, you start from the very beginning of whatever level you're on. Also, although it is a beat 'em up, there aren't actually that many beat 'em up levels. Now, normally this would be a good thing, as the gameplay does vary wildly between levels here, which is great, but the new style forces you to learn something new each time, not letting you use the skills that you've actually learnt before. And again, most levels will have so many instant death traps that you won't see much of anything anyway. It's such a shame, as I was convinced that I loved this game, but going back to replay it, I really didn't find myself having a very good time. I did get slightly further every time I played, and managed to get to the 3rd level, but after taking me nearly 2 hours to get past the infamous speeder bike level, I just had no desire to try again, and let's be honest, I probably never will. Despite what I've said, I don't think this is a bad game. It's just, there's a lot of bullshit, and it's all completely intentional from the developer. It's just not me anymore. I know there's people out there that love this game, and I can see why, but for me, the deliberate cheap level design just doesn't appeal to me anymore. If you think you're hard enough, definitely give this game a go, but for anyone that wants to actually beat a video game, maybe steer clear of it for now. Next up is Knights of the Round by Capcom, who back in the day were the masters of making these kinds of games. As you can probably guess, this is based off the legend of King Arthur, and it lets you choose from 3 ye olde fighters, Arthur, Percival and Lancelot. And these guys have the usual array of stats you'd expect from this kind of game. This is one of the closest on the SNES to Golden Axe. Graphically, the game looks decent with big characters, and there's quite a lot going on in the backgrounds. Gameplay wise, it's your standard beat 'em up fare, with an attack button that you hammer to do combos and a special button that if you hit enemies with it, it will drain a bit of your life, but usually this is a good way of getting out of a crowded situation. Most of the enemies here are knights or other medieval themed fare, and they of course suit the game down to a T. The bosses are large and suitably intimidating, though they do often fall into the cheap beat 'em up trope of being able to hit you mid-combo, which is always annoying. Knights of the Round does do something pretty groundbreaking for a game of this genre though, and it gives you a block button. This actually wasn't very common at all in games like this, meaning I forgot to use it most of the time, but when I did remember, it was clear that it's actually a really useful thing, and getting used to using it will definitely help you get through the game. Most enemy attacks are blockable, with bosses usually having a couple of moves that you can't block, which is fine. Another nice inclusion is that your character levels up after reaching a certain amount of points. When you do level up, your armour and weapon change, and it's cool seeing how each character changes the stronger they got. I'll be honest, I didn't notice any change in how the character played. I thought that maybe I'd deal more damage or take less as I got stronger, but it really didn't seem like it, which did make the whole thing feel a little bit redundant. However, it was still cool to see how they changed. There isn't much in the way of variety here, but thankfully the game can be beaten in about an hour, as is standard, with some levels being noticeably shorter than others, and some even letting you ride a horse, which is awesome, and definitely my favourite thing about the game, as you become almost unstoppable. Really, that's all there is to say about this one. It's a fairly standard game of this genre, but is definitely playable, and the setting does make it stand out. Now, while I didn't get to play any of these with a friend, I imagine this would have been a really good one in co-op. While it does get repetitive, the short length means it doesn't outstay its welcome. We'll stick with swords and shields for now and take a look at Legend by everyone's favourite developer, Arcade Zone. What do you mean you've never heard of Arcade Zone? They made Legend on the SNES, you know. Anyway, Legend is a 1 or 2 player sword 'em up where you get to play as the stupidly named Kaor and Igor, if you're playing 2 player that is, who, you've guessed it, they have to walk from left to right punching people in the face, or slashing them with their sword I guess. I'll tell you, it's already getting difficult to think of no ways to say that. These games all basically play the same, let's be honest. But back to it. You walk from left to right swinging your sword to kill a decent bunch of enemies here, all of which look fantastic. The graphics here really stand out and the animation is actually really good. Your attacks, while pretty slow, do have some weight behind them, but the combat is actually pretty decent. The trick here is just to hold the attack button down, and you'll keep swinging your sword, and don't worry if an enemy comes up behind you, as you can press towards the enemy and you'll do an overhead slash to mess them up. You can also press the L or R buttons to get your shield out to block attacks. This is definitely needed throughout the game. This all works well until you get to the bosses though, who unfortunately are very cheap and often ignore your attacks completely. I found it almost impossible to get past most bosses without losing at least 1 life. Most of the time they just ignore what you're doing and slap you about, doing a lot of damage, while your damages are about as effective as tickling them. Throughout the levels, the enemies will drop health for you, as well as the occasional magic potion. These work in a similar way to Golden Axe, in that the more you have, the more powerful the magic you create. This is really cool, and seeing the different effects are fun, though there's not really that many different ones. One of my main complaints with the game is probably the speed of it. Everything just moves pretty slowly, which I think makes the game harder at some points. I felt like it could have been about 50% faster, and it would have made everything just that little bit smoother. As always, there aren't loads of levels here, which is good, as there's no save or password, but the levels are surprisingly long, and they do get pretty tough. Unfortunately, the enemies stay largely the same. You do get a few new ones every now and then, and it does break things up a bit, but like most games like this, more variety would have been better. This is another one that would be really good in 2 player, though player 2 is just a reskin of the first, so there's no difference in the characters, which is a bit of a shame. It would have been nice to have a few characters to choose from to at least increase the replay value, but at least you can play it in 2 player. This is one of those games that's good fun to play through, but once you've finished it, there's not really any reason to go back. Next up is Rival Turf from Jaleco, which is actually part of a trilogy of games, but I'm not talking about the other ones today, soz. This is more of a traditional beat 'em up like Streets of Rage or Final Fight, just nowhere near as polished as those games. Here you choose from one of 2 characters in either single or co-op play. You have Flak, who is your standard medium everything stat guy, and he plays pretty well, and he looks totally rad in his jean and jacket combo. Then you have Nelson, who looks like a budget M Bison, and is your slow but strong character, and that's it. If you care about the story, well, it's your standard bad guy rolls into town, so you have to drive them out by sending 1 or 2 people to punch them a lot. You make your way through various urban landscapes, happy slapping thugs and occasionally finding a weapon to use on them. The game looks alright with some fun character designs, but it's nothing really more than generic. There is a nice colour palette to it all though, and the controls are responsive here. However, the hit detection just never feels quite right, and it gives the game a cheap, almost unfinished quality to it. Regular enemies will often ignore your attacks and hit you mid-combo, and of course bosses are even worse for this, making it hard to beat them without taking a ton of damage yourself. This actually seems to be worse when you're playing as Nelson, who has some very slow attacks, and they have an annoyingly short range. He also has one of the most useless jump attacks I think I've ever used. I always preferred playing as Flak, even though he does have a stupid name. Some of the enemies here are cool though, especially the bosses, and there's a guy called Arnold who really is just Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I like that a lot. Honestly, there's not really much more to say about this one. It's a competent enough game, though it lacks the polish that makes it a particularly great game. However, you probably will get a little bit of fun out of it. Sonic Blastman from Taito is a very quirky take on the beat-em-up genre, letting you play as Sonic Blastman, who comes from another planet dressed as a boombox and comes to Earth to dish out justice. At least he would if he wasn't so useless. Sonic Blastman has your usual array of combos and a special move that clears crowds but damages you, but interestingly he has a variety of throw attacks, which are different depending on the direction you're holding on the D-pad when you throw them. Some enemies can block certain ones of these throws, so you have to learn which attacks are best against which enemies. This is actually a pretty nice touch and adds a bit more strategy to it. Unfortunately, the hit detection and the general gameplay here is pretty sloppy, which makes it not that fun to play. Also, your attack range is way shorter than it feels like it should be, and I found that I was punching the air most of the time. Enemies are also way tougher than they need to be, and even just the regular thugs can kick your ass in just a few hits. You do get quite a few lives and continues though. As with most games like this, you'll be making your way through various urban locations, fighting the same 5 or 6 enemies repeatedly, and there's moments where it's actually pretty fun to play. One strange design though is that there are no other characters, meaning this is a single player only, and it gives you even less reason to fire it up, unless you love playing these games on your own. Now, here's the main thing with Sonic Blastman that makes it stand out though. As far as I can tell, it's a spin-off of those arcade games where you have to punch the actual punching pad, which then damages enemies in the game. I remember seeing it in the arcades as a kid. Here, after each level, you can choose a bonus round, which is a first-person view, and you have 3 punches to do a certain amount of damage to the enemy, ranging from street thugs to crazy mutant crabs, even asteroids you have to punch with your fists to stop them crashing into the earth. In the minigame, you have to build up your meter and time your attack to do maximum damage. It took me a while to figure out exactly how it worked, but these actually turned out to be pretty fun. The problem is that the rest of the game is so unpolished and janky that it makes it hard to actually get to one of these stages. That makes this one tricky to decide on, as I do kind of like these elements when I get to them, but I really had to force myself to replay the game to get there. While this isn't really a terrible game, it's just so painfully mediocre that I really needed some polish to really recommend it. I saw that it does have a sequel, so at some point I'll probably give that a go, probably when I do a part 2 of this topic. But for this one, I wouldn't really recommend it, except if you wanted to try out these funky punchy sections. And finally for today we have Undercover Cops, which only came out in Japan. It's a port of the arcade game of the same name, and like most ports, while it did have to make some sacrifices, it actually turned out pretty well. The story here is the usual thing, there's a bad gang, so some undercover cops get sent in to punch everyone in the face until they get to the big boss. Right off the bat you'll notice that the game looks great. It's a bit of a cross between Final Fight and Metal Slug, which is always a good thing. The animation here is decent, and there's always a lot going on in the background. The levels themselves are sort of what you'd expect, but somehow they do a really good job of standing out from other games. That's either through the aesthetic or the general feel of the game, which is a little bit quirky. You have a good variety of enemies here that include your usual grunts as well as enemies with weapons, etc. They're all fun to fight, and there seems to be a few new ones on every level, which really helps. And thankfully, the controls and hit detection here are solid. Of course, there is your standard attack button that does a combo, and you have the usual array of throws and jump attacks, as well as an area attack that does a small amount of damage to you when you use it, but it's normally the best option to use if you're surrounded. Something here that is really cool are the weapons. You can pick up large girders or concrete bollards to smash enemies, and these all feel great to use. The heavier items often have to be pulled out the ground, and you need to mash the attack button to pick them up, and it really gives them some weight to them. The boss fights in the game are all good too. All of the bosses here are crazy, and some even have traps or hazards on their stage, and you can use these to make short work of the actual boss, though you often need perfect timing, but when you do manage to pull it off, it's really satisfying. And even better with the bosses is that you don't really get that annoying cheapness where they hit you through your combos, which is very rare in games like this. But they're still challenging. This is down to their strength and having to figure out their attack patterns though. It never got frustrating and it kept me wanting to try again. It's not all perfect though. As with most games of the genre, it can get a bit boring after a few levels as it is the same thing over and over. But thanks to the decent variety and the bosses really standing out from other games in the genre, it's not as much of an issue here. You do have 3 characters to choose from and you'll soon find your favourite, but the biggest issue here is that they had to remove the multiplayer, meaning that you can't play this through with a friend, which is a real shame. Still, it's one of my favourites that I've played on the Super Nintendo. If you're a fan of the genre, definitely give this one a go. There's English patches out there, so if you do need the story, but it's the gameplay that you'll be hanging around for. So there you go, a handful of beat 'em ups released for the Super Nintendo. Let us know your favourites for the SNES as well as any other system. These games are a perfect way to kill half an hour, and I love finding new ones. Don't forget to subscribe, we upload new videos when we've made them, and check out the 2 Guys 1 Game podcast where we talk about all things gaming and everything in between. It's available wherever you get your podcasts, just search 2 Guys 1 Game. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram where I've got over 600 retro and modern video game reviews. Just search for The Reviews Brothers. Now, all that's left for me to say is thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.